Yes. Okay. Thank you so much for having me for the event. My talk is Singapore's battle against COVID-19 under a global perspective. The picture on the front page signals my general position on the future course of Singapore's economy. I am cautiously optimistic. In the recent World Economic Outlook, the IMF defines the current public health and economic crisis as a crisis like no others. It predicts that the world economy will decline by 5% this year, while the advanced economy will see an 8% loss in GDP. And this is certainly a crisis like no other to Singapore as well. The last quarter just witnessed a lowest GDP growth rate in our history. The first half of 2020 has a real GDP growth rate minus 6.7%. Recently, the MTI has projected this year's real GDP to decline by 5 to 7% from last year. The Economic Society of Singapore has organized this webinar to discuss a set of tough, but I believe highly pertinent questions. Now, here are my answers after some homework. The answers are short, but apparently not simple. I think, in general, the global economic recovery depends on two things. One is how long and how severe this global pandemic will last. This is mainly in the domain of epidemiology and immunology. And the second is how well the public policies will contain the virus and revive the economy. This is mainly in the domain of public policy and economics. Of course, in the context of Singapore, one has to take into account the specific structure of Singapore economy. Under this logic, I have 4 bullet points to share. One is to take a closer look at the global and Singapore pandemic. Second is to examine how Singapore has been containing the pandemic relative to other countries. This point is mainly based on my joint research with my colleague, Fen Qu, and our PhD students, Yuan Menying and Zhou Shihao. The third is to evaluate Singapore's economic policy. For this part, I will largely give credit to the recent reports from MTI and MAS. Finally, I will conclude Singapore's economic recovery as a K-shaped recovery. Now, due to time constraint, I will only be very brief on the third and fourth points. If any of you happen to be interested, the full version of my presentation slides will be available on the Society webpage. Okay, point number 1. These 2 figures give us an overview on the COVID-19 situation globally and in Singapore. The left panel is the global daily infection and global daily death reported to WHO from early January to middle August. As we see, even in recent weeks, every day, more than 250,000 people are confirmed infected by the coronavirus, and more than 5,000 people lose their lives due to the coronavirus. This suggests the pandemic has not been under control at the global scale. The right panel is a daily infection by different groups of Singapore. As we know, so far, only 27 COVID-19 caused deaths are reported in Singapore. Therefore, mortality is not a major concern in Singapore. However, in terms of infection, more than 56,000 cases are reported, among which 95% are dormitory cases. The community and imported cases see a first peak in early April and a small second wave in early July, but is generally declining over time. So my point number 2, how Singapore has been battling against COVID-19 infection and death. To answer this question, we need first to control a set of predetermined factors that may affect how vulnerable a country is inherently to COVID-19. And second, we need to have a fair benchmark arriving from a statistic tool. This figure highlights our main finding from our regression analysis using cross-country data in the past 8 months. We plot the 3 most important risk factors in red and 4 most important protective factors in blue. The length of the bars indicates the percentage change in infections per million people due to 1 standard deviation increase in a factor. For example, all else being equal, enhancing the government effectiveness from a level of Italian, which happens to be our sample average, to the level of South Korea, which is 1 standard deviation higher than the sample average, would reduce infections by more than 70%. Think of Singapore. This is a country with world's highest GDP per capita. And we are definitely the country with highest population density. Meanwhile, the income inequality is also pronounced in Singapore. All these predict high risk of infection for Singapore. However, on the other hand, we also have the world's best health infrastructure and government effectiveness. We have also learned a good lesson from the SARS outbreak, and we are blessed by a high temperature in this case. So overall, how has Singapore been doing relative to other countries? Here, we list pandemic policy efficiency ranking for 100 countries with sufficient data. If we evaluate Singapore using total number of infections, it is ranked 77th place in the world, which is even worse than UK, US, and Spain. However, if we only look at community and imported cases, Singapore is ranked world number 17. The big difference in these 2 numbers, once again, reveals the poor living conditions of the migrant foreign workers and highlights the serious neglect of the welfare of a large group of people. Fortunately, the case fatality rate for this group is almost 0. Therefore, Singapore's death ranking is world number 14, only next to New Zealand, South Korea, Japan, among advanced economies. So to conclude, Singapore has been doing very well in saving the lives and relatively well in containing the virus. So why this is important? This is because we find that there is a significant negative relationship between the pandemic policy efficiency and GDP loss. Here, the horizontal axis are the infection and death ranking from our empirical exercise. Pay attention. The smaller the values, the better a country has been tackling the pandemic. The vertical axis is the differences in GDP growth rate between the first half of 2020 and the first half of 2019. So the smaller the values, the less a country has lost in aggregate output. Therefore, the downward sloping curve suggests that a country that has been dealing with the pandemic better, in fact, has less GDP loss. Now, this is really the single most important message I would like to take away from my talk. We'll understand that for a given point of time and for a given fiscal budget constraint, there is a trade-off between lives and livelihoods. For example, a longer lockdown and a stricter containment policy will certainly lead to more output loss for that period. However, if we extend our horizon, not too long, just for half year, and if we compare across countries with similar economic background, we find, in fact, better pandemic control leads to less economic loss and probably quicker economic recovery. I think the fundamental mechanism lies in the power of the market itself. Households, firms, and the rest of the world do react for their best interest and under their expectation. In this case, the pandemic itself is the most important factor in their expectation. Remember, one of the key words come up from the audience is uncertainty. So for this reason, I'm cautiously optimistic about Singapore's economy. Of course, this does not mean the government should do nothing on economic policy. And this is my point 3. As Professor Lee has already helped us go through the major budget Singapore government has been implemented in the past several months, I'm going to be very brief on this. Just to give you a very simple benchmark. So the total stimulus package up till last week accounts 20% of 2020 GDP of Singapore, while the average fiscal stimulus in advanced economy is about 9% of GDP. And according to economic survey and analysis by the MTI and MAS, the immediate effects and the short-term effects of Singapore's stimulus package are all very positive. I also have evidence from the foreign exchange markets. Of course, it will be too early to evaluate the medium and the long-term effects, although I believe these are definitely important public policy to be evaluated. Okay, my last point, how Singapore's economy is going to look like. There are both a lot of upside factors and a lot of downside factors for recovery, which I don't have the time to elaborate, but which I believe all of you have a good idea on them. So let me jump into my conclusion. I think, like most other advanced economy, Singapore's economic recovery is most likely to be K-shaped. In other words, some will get their momentum back and have a V-shaped recovery. Others will stay at the bottom for quite a while, if not persistently. This is true not only for different sectors and industries, but also true for different people in the assets market and in the labor market. So, final word, what is the policy implication? I think there are two. One is the policies should look after interest and welfare for the sector and the people in the downside part of the K-shape in order to narrow the gap between the two parts of the K. Implication number 2. This is a crisis, but this could also be an opportunity to speed up a structural transformation. That is to reallocate people and capital and resources from the downside of the K to the upside of the K. You can either call it creative destruction, or you might want to call it structural transformation. Thank you. That's all I would like to speak